We're getting ready to start our unit on speculative fiction. This is a broad literary genre encompassing any fiction with supernatural, fantastical, or futuristic elements. This includes fantasy, dystopia, and science fiction novels. When we talk about speculative fiction, these three distinct categories in turquoise stand out as the main genres. Underneath them are subgenres. Some people argue that dystopia is a subgenre of either fantasy or science fiction, depending on the particular details of the story. But a lot of people say that it's its own category within speculative fiction, and that's how we're going to handle it. There are lots more subgenres than the ones listed here, and we're not going to go into depth about all of these, but we're going to briefly define them. So in fantasy, we have high or epic fantasy. So this is the hero's quest and journey. It's a it's a journey story. Fairy tales are things that you're very familiar with. Disney has made $1 million on every fairy tale that they've cranked out as a cartoon, but in YA lit, they're retold in a certain way. So they're fairy tales, but they're retold in a more adult or twisted ending. Dark fantasy is also a form of fantasy horror. Portal fantasy is where there's a portal or an object that allows a main character to go from one reality to another. Historical fantasy speculates about what was happening as with fantasy elements in a historic time period. So it has elements of historic fiction, but it has fantastical elements that classify it as a fantasy. Mythology gods and demons are based on mythologies from around the world or mythologies that are created by the writer. Sword and sorcery has to do with magic. Harry Potter would fall into that category. Superheroes tend to be covered more in comics and graphic novels than in YA novels, but there are some YA novel adaptations about superheroes. Paranormal romance, we already covered in the romance genre video, but if there is a supernatural character, a fantasy element, it also falls technically within fantasy as well. Magical Girl flips the script on a damsel in distress who needs to be rescued by a hero and empowers the girl with special powers that she is learning to master in order to solve her own problems. Contemporary fantasy would be a story that is set in our world today as we know it, but has fantasy elements to it. So, an example of this would be A Blade So Black, which is the retelling of Alice in Wonderland with an African American teen living in Atlanta, Georgia. And that also overlaps portal fantasy because she can go to Wonderland through a portal. So that covers fantasy and some of the most popular subgenres. All of these genres can have elements of humor, adventure, romance, mystery, or horror, and frequently do. In science fiction, there are several subgenres beyond the ones listed here, but these are the most common. In a parallel universe, there are two universes, and sometimes the main character can go from one to the other, or sometimes what happens in one universe impacts the other universe. In alternate history, this is speculation about what would happen if a certain invention or technology had been present at a historical time period, how that would have changed history. Cyberpunk is a category that might be a word you haven't heard of before, but as soon as I read the definition, you are going to be able to connect it to something you have seen. This is a subgenre of science fiction that incorporates our concern about the future impact of advanced technologies, especially cybernetics, bionics, genetic engineering, and the designer drug culture upon the individual, who is competing with the increasing power and control of the multinational corporations that are extending their stranglehold on the world's supply of information. I'm certain that you've seen at least one of them on Netflix. Wild adventure or techno thriller is also sometimes called a space opera, and Star Wars falls into that category. Space exploration and aliens is pretty straightforward as well. You know what that involves. So those are subgenres within these three branches of speculative fiction. When we talk about fantasy, fantasy is a subgenre of speculative fiction that features magical or supernatural elements that do not exist in the real world. They're inspired by myths and folklore. They may include beings inspired by traditional stories such as dragons, elves, sorcerers, or other magical creatures. They use magic or supernatural elements as a main plot element, theme, or setting. It's important to the story. And they don't have to follow the laws of nature. They still need to follow the laws of the story or the world that the author has created, but they don't have to follow the laws of nature as we know them. And it's a very broad genre. It can incorporate all sorts of things. It's probably one of the most broad genres that we've studied this year. It appeals to readers primarily as escapism. So it's an opportunity to lose yourself in your imagination where anything is possible. Readers want stories that will take them to a world not like this one. Tamora Pierce has this to say about fantasy. Fantasy, more than any other genre, is a literature of empowerment. In the real world, kids have little say. This is a given. It is the nature of childhood. In fantasy, however short, fat, unbeautiful, weak, dreamy, or unlearned individuals may be, they find a realm in which those things are negated by strength. The catch is that empowerment brings trials. In good novels, heroes and heroines contend as much with their granted wishes as readers do in normal life. Fantasy has a very long history. It goes back to 1200 BC to mythological stories and the oral tradition, where stories were passed down by oral tradition by just speaking them and people listening to them and memorizing them and being able to repeat them from generation to generation. And one of the oldest fantasies is the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the 100 to 200s, fairy tales were recorded in print across various cultures. In the 1400s, we have King Arthur and his legends retold by Sir Thomas Malory. Alice in Wonderland was printed in 1865, so we're getting into the Victorian era. 1904, Peter Pan. In 1923, in the US, the first all fantasy magazine was published called Weird Tales. It consisted of fantasy and horror stories. It was pulp fiction, so these were very cheap magazines, very easy to purchase because they were affordable. And sometimes they would run an episode at a time. So it wouldn't be a complete story, it would be an ongoing story, and you'd read a chapter in each magazine that you bought. In the 1950s, The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia popularized fantasy novels. That is largely recognized as sort of the on ramp to fantasy novels for young adults. In 1997, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was another turning point in the development of fantasy novels. That's the title it was published under in the United Kingdom. J.K. Rowling changed things for fantasy in the publishing industry. The popularity of Harry Potter and the amount of money that that brought into the publisher and to the bookstores really caught the attention of publishers, and they started giving more serious consideration to manuscripts of fantasy stories that they received that they had been getting all along but had just not taken as seriously. So when they saw that there was a market for it and money to be made, they started opening up that area of novel development. In 2005, Twilight popularized vampire novels. We had a whole series of those that came out, and it's become increasingly popular in multimedia formats. movies and video games and toys and cosplay, fantasy is just blowing up. Here are some common fantasy subgenres that we mentioned. When we talk about tropes in fantasy, there is one of the most common is a magical being gaining self-awareness. This is usually a teenage protagonist and they're coming of age. So they're learning how to manage their magical powers, how they work, and it's trial and error, and there's a lot of uncertainty that parallels that passage in adolescent development, and that is the most common trope. The battle between good and evil is another very common trope that you'll see in fantasy novels. Hero's journey or quest. And that gets woven in with a lot of stories. Even if that is not the main story, a lot of stories will have a quest aspect to them. Independence, coming to a point of separating yourself from an evil organization or finding your own way in the world or leaving your country or area of life, all that gets woven into stories pretty commonly too. Transformation is another thing that is woven throughout stories. You're changing from one thing to another, or you're bringing about change in your society. That can come up too. Races and species, that comes into play when authors are creating their own worlds and their own world building stories. It gets very developed. People develop lots of races and species that have never been thought of before. And sometimes they're purely imaginative, and other times the authors are trying to use them to represent groups of people in our own society to comment on that or make you think about their place in the world. The damsel in distress is an old trope from the original stories of maidens needing to be rescued. But as history has changed over time and as our sensibilities about things have changed, this has become less popular. And so now it's transforming into the damsel in distress flips the script to empower herself. And this is often through a magic power or through learning how to do something. School or training to master newly realized powers. This is where Harry Potter comes in. Magical schools did not originate with Harry Potter, but that's the best known example of that. There's frequently magical characters who are in a school or academy or training program to master their powers. When we look at common writing styles, they're plot driven stories, especially if they're a quest. They have to go on a specific trip and they meet hardships along the way and address them. Plot driven. Genre blending, you'll see in any of these genres and subgenres. They often borrow from mythology. That's frequent. Lots of transformation of characters from one thing to another through magic, and they're emotionally intense. That emotional intensity is kind of what sucks readers in. Marjorie N. Allen said fantasies often have more to do with reality than any so called realistic fiction. Fantasy touches on universal truths. So, this idea that when you're reading fantasy, you're not just escaping reality, you're thinking about reality in different ways. And it allows you to be more critical about the things that you see in life and more aware of the things that you see in life as a result of your interaction with a story. When you're looking at how to measure quality in fantasy novels, the detail of world building is important to consider. And that doesn't have to be 7,000 details. It can be 5 different things in that world that are just really paid attention to. So it's not that you need a more involved, more detailed world. You just need the world that you have created to be detailed enough to be clearly understood by the reader and visualized. Creativity and imagination. Original, is it an original story or is it the same as 3 other novels that you've read about kings and kingdoms. Strong characterization. Characters in fantasy should be really well developed, and they frequently are. That tends to be a strength of this genre. Plot consistency is important, especially with world building. When the world is built a certain way, it needs to make sense. And if, as a reader, you're going along and there's a part that is inconsistent with the world that's been created, it's like hitting a speed bump while you're reading. This genre is not without criticisms. They can lack depth. They can be childish tales without any substance. It was a neat idea, but the writer didn't take the time to go deep and develop it. They just skimmed the surface with the story, and it was a flimsy tale instead of being a well-developed one. Lack of representation or diversity. Typically, it's just a very white genre, and that has been changing in just in the last 2 or 3 years. There's been a lot more representation of all different types of diversity. Plot flaws or contradictions are common enough to be a point of criticism for the genre, and censors may object to the use of magic and say that it has a negative influence on young readers. So oftentimes, fantasy books are on censored book lists when there's magic involved. And Harry Potter has certainly been a good example of that. That has been banned many, many times in places. Trends within fantasy, there's increasing diversity in characters and sources, especially in the area of mythologies from different cultures and in the area of representing characters with various forms of ability. Feminism is a trend in fantasy. Female empowerment and strong heroines, girl gangs, or groups of women fighting for change. Sweeping fantasies, entirely made up worlds and societies, not just a world that's sort of like ours and has one thing different, but totally different worlds that you don't know anything about except as the writer presents to you in the book. This ties in with escapism. A lot of what's happening now in fantasy novels is responding to the pandemic and people needing a break and needing a sweeping fantasy to get caught up in. I put utopia and dystopia between fantasy and science fiction because it's its own little thing and it borrows from both of them. So it's not fantasy or science fiction, but it shares elements with both. Readers have to suspend their disbelief and buy into the author's vision for that utopia or dystopia. It's usually set in the future, with technology having played a role in the conditions out of which the story grows. So that's where it borrows from science fiction. Once the situation of the story is established, though, the author focuses less on technology and more on sociological or emotional aspects of the story. Utopia comes from the Greek word for good place, in which all of the world's problems are solved. It has a very long history. It started with Plato's Republic in the 5th century BC, and it outlined his idea for the ideal world, which would be ruled by a wise philosopher king who would ensure people would prosper, joy would flourish, and the land would be safe. In 1516, Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia, which argued that the path to the perfect society was recognizing mental equality between men and women, having simple laws that everyone could understand, and having common ownership of everything. Dystopia means diseased or bad land. It's more dramatic and exaggerated than utopias are. And dystopias are a warning of society's drift towards a particularly horrifying or sick world just around the corner. Control is what it's about. Usually dystopias start out as utopias, and then it shifts very quickly into a dystopia as the story progresses. Science fiction is a subgenre of speculative fiction that focuses on the impact of actual or imagined science upon worlds, societies, or individuals. It features technologies and other elements that do not exist in real life, but may be supposed to be created or discovered in the future through scientific advancement. such as advanced robots, interstellar travel, aliens, time travel, mutants, and cyborgs. Many science fiction stories are set in the future. The appeal is an escape from the limits of everyday thinking to see what is possible. It can be a very good intellectual challenge to dive into a good science fiction novel. It's a literary response to the technological explosion that we're living in our world today. There's a lot of excitement, there's the thrill of a good adventure. It allows anyone to read an imaginative story without feeling like it's a book for little kids. It also presents real-world heroes doing noble things in worlds without anyone worth admiring, like situations that teens may be facing as they look around them. Science fiction has a shorter history than fantasy. It basically kicked off in 1818 with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. That is science fiction and not fantasy because the scientist created the creature through his knowledge of biology, not magic. YA science fiction has developed much slower than adult sci-fi. In most of the history of science fiction, teens who liked to read it had to read science fiction that was written for adults because it wasn't written for them for a long time. In 1869, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne was published. That was for an adult audience. So was War of the Worlds and The Lost World. Although the first pulp fiction magazines were published around the 1870s, the ones that targeted teens weren't really around until the 30s. And at that time, pulp fiction magazines and radio shows targeting teen readers included stories about a boy genius inventor who created helicopter airships and robots. Buck Rogers in the 25th Century was another popular radio show. And in the 30s, comic strips in the newspaper included Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. So that's when the teen audience started to grow more. And then in the 50s to the present, it has continued to grow in popularity as a genre as society becomes more technologically based. In fact, fantasy and science fiction are two of the fastest growing genres in YA Lit. Here are some common science fiction subgenres just to help you sort of place them in your brain where they fit. Some tropes that you will see in science fiction include beings and entities. So, this focus on otherness and sameness. What's the difference between a human, an alien, and a machine? Origin stories, where characters might not know if they're human or machine or alien. That kind of thing would be in the beings and entities trope. Body and mind alterations is another trope. This has to do with consciousness and self awareness, intelligence and artificial intelligence, human fears extrapolated. Sometimes you have characters who are telepathic and surprise each other with that ability because they didn't know that they could connect to someone. Habitats have to do with parallel worlds, other worlds, environmental disasters, the need to travel from one world to another because of an environmental disaster, that sort of thing. Political conflicts are about societies in conflict or war zones and how that impacts the world. Technology could be implications for humankind, cloning and DNA, moral responsibility of scientists. If we create this, what is our obligation to the world? And then the future is sort of wide open. It can include anything that's possible in the future. It can include time travel. That is a trope that has been a part of science fiction as long as the genre has existed. Common writing styles, they're also plot driven. They're based on the thought or the premise of the story, and it has to follow very close reasoning. They blend genre a lot. You will see more humor in science fiction than in most fantasy novels. That's kind of growing in popularity right now. They may be optimistic about the future and reflect the reality that teens may be able to avoid mistakes their elders made and may be able to create better new realities on their own. Arthur C. Clarke, a popular science fiction writer from several generations ago, wrote, "A critical reading of science fiction is essential training for anyone wishing to look more than 10 years ahead." And one of the things that is unique to science fiction is that many things that are written about in science fiction eventually come to be fact in the future because science fiction writers are not making things up out of their own minds. They are paying attention to what's happening in science and in society, and they're speculating about what would be possible down the road with a little more technology and time. And so things like self driving cars were a thing in science fiction in the 50s and 60s, and now you can get a Tesla that will park itself. So a lot of things like that start in science fiction and then become reality in our world as technology develops. How do you measure the quality of science fiction? The technology needs to be believable. It doesn't have to be believable at the time. You just have to believe that it's within the realm of possibility for this technology to exist. Needs to be well-reasoned speculation about the future. You need to be able to follow along with the thought of, "Oh, yeah, that could happen." Plot and society must have internal consistency and plausibility. So if you have rules within a society, then that society needs to follow them. If you have rules within the plot or within that universe, then everything that happens need to follow along with those uh, consistent plot points and be believable within that society and that plot. And they also provide real insight into real world issues. So, real world issues like the role of technology in society, what technology is doing to us as people, what's on the horizon for what might be possible for us as human beings, what are the dangers of things that we're doing to the environment, things that we know and we can see actual science based results, data. This is a problem in our environment. What's that going to be like in the future? So they give you insight. These stories that are really well crafted give you insight into real world issues like that. Criticisms. They can be too focused on technical details or science, or there can be insufficient explanations for what happens. So you have to hit the sweet spot. You have to explain the technology or the science enough without boring people. And you have to put in enough detail so that the plot makes sense to people. There can be a lack of representation or diversity. Plot flaws or contradictions are fatal in science fiction. That's like the worst thing that you can do as a bad science fiction writer because it wrecks your whole argument, your whole premise that you're building is wrecked if you have a plot flaw or a contradiction. They may lack character development. Sometimes they're so focused on the plot and on making the science work or the story work that they don't fully flesh out their characters. And when examined closely, many sci fi novels rely more on fantasy elements than scientific speculation. So they may call themselves sci fi, but they may really be fantasy. Trends in science fiction. There is a wider array of visions about possible future realities, some of which can be hopeful. There's a surprise. The lines are blurring between young adult and adult science fiction. Sometimes the only difference is the age of the characters and the amount of scientific detail. Multimedia development, movies, graphic novels, video and role playing games, toys, cartoons allow readers to live the adventure. This is sort of the whole premise behind Universal Studios in Florida. Writers are increasingly using science fiction as a way to urge people to examine the impact of government policies, cultural habits of consumption, and attitudes about others. So you get a lot of warning type novels in science fiction of if this keeps happening, then this will be the result. Change now while you're still ahead. Here are the sources for this lecture. I hope you enjoy speculative fiction as much as I do.